Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Education. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Hammer conversation with Homan Majd and Reza Aslan. And Happy New Year to all of you as well. The concept of the Hammer conversation is to bring together people from different fields of art and culture in provocative conversations of the topic of their choice. So tonight we have Dr. Reza Aslan. He's a writer and a scholar of religions. He was born in Iran and now lives in Los Angeles, where he's an associate professor of creative writing at UC Riverside. He has degrees in religions from Santa Clara University, Harvard, UC Santa Barbara, as well as a Master in Fine Arts from the University of Iowa, where he was awarded the Truman Capote Fellowship for Fiction. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities, and the Pacific Council on International Policy. He also serves on the board of directors of the Plowshares Fund, which gives grants for peace and security issues, and Abraham's Vision, an interfaith peace organization, and PEN USA, which champions the rights of writers under siege around the world. And he serves on the National Advisory Board of the Levantine Cultural Center, which builds bridges between Americans and the Arab Muslim world. Aslan's first book is the international bestseller No God But God, The Origin, Evolution, and Future of Islam, and it was translated into 13 languages and named one of the 100 most important books of the last decade. He's also the author of How to Win a Cosmic War, and he's the editor of the anthology Tablet and Pen, Literary Landscapes from the Modern Middle East. Homan Majd is an Iranian-American writer based in New York City. He was born in Tehran, and as his family was involved in the diplomatic services, he attended boarding schools in England and then college in the United States, where he currently resides. He's written for the New York Times, The New Yorker, Salon, GQ, The New Republic, Foreign Policy, Politico, The New York Observer, and The Daily Beast, as well as The Huffington Post, Salon, and Interview, where he's also a contributing editor. His first book, The Ayatollah Begs to Differ, was published in 2008, and his new book, The Ayatollah's Democracy, An Iranian Challenge, was published this fall and is an insider's account of what's happened behind the scenes in Iran since the disputed elections in 2009. So tonight we have two authors, both of whom can speak in detail about the politics and culture of Iran and what it means for that country, as well as for the United States. So please join me in welcoming Reza Aslan and Homan Majd.
Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you. I'm just going to begin by acknowledging what most in the audience already know, which is that Homan and I are both secret agents of the Islamic Republic. We are here to infiltrate your country and then eventually pave the way for the Iranian takeover of America.
Yeah.
So let's just
Complete
get that
domination.
part out of the way.
Complete domination.
From the beginning.
Yes. Because we know that question's going to come up.
Yes. It's a great joy. It's a great joy to be here. Human and I haven't seen you in a while.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an absolutely
talking about
fantastic to share a stage with you and to see our friends and people who've come out tonight with this incredible traffic on Wilshire Boulevard.
Yes, and we imagine people will continue to be streaming in. So.
I'm from New York, and I've never seen traffic like this before, so it's pretty bad.
We're and Khosh Amadid. Welcome to what we like to call Tarangelis. Yeah. We're going to start the conversation, and then after a few minutes, or after like 20, 30 minutes, I guess, sure, we're going to get you guys involved in it. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier is that, there's so much about Iran, there's so much that's been said about Iran, so much that you and I have said about Iran, that we want to eschew the sort of simplistic beginnings that often start these kinds of conversations. And we want to kind of delve in and start thinking a little bit differently. And so the first thing that I want to bring up, Homan John, is the possibility, as we're starting to really, think about this now, that we may have gotten Ahmadinejad all wrong. That it turns out that he may very well be this incredible liberalizing reformer. And I say this because in the midst of the WikiLeaks dumps, there were two items about Iran that just recently came out that really paint an unusual picture, not just about what's going on in Iran and who's calling the shots, but about Ahmadinejad himself. The first involves the nuclear negotiations issue. It turns out that Ahmadinejad is actually far, far more accommodating when it comes to Iran's nuclear program than anyone would have thought before. Now, we know the leak that I'm talking about involves something that happened in October of 2009, in which Ahmadinejad sent his chief nuclear negotiator to Geneva to begin the process of dialogue with the so-called P5+1. These are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. And if you recall, at the end of those Geneva meetings, the 5 plus Germany and Iran put the outline together for a remarkable nuclear agreement through which Iran decided that it would ship some 75% of its enriched uranium, 2,600 pounds, I guess, of it, to Russia and to France, where it would be enriched to 20%, and then they would bring it back. That meant that Iran would no longer have enough enriched uranium in order to develop a nuclear weapon. Huge deal. It broke down in Iran, and what the WikiLeaks has shown us now is that it broke down because both the right and the left, Mousavi on the left, people like Larijani on the right, condemned it. And that regardless of that condemnation, Ahmadinejad kept pushing throughout the rest of the year, even as the rest of Iran gave up on that, kept pushing for that agreement. Also turns out in the WikiLeaks dump that there's this remarkable story, of course, in which it's at the very height of the Green Movement demonstrations, at the very height of it, June 2009 at this point. And there is a secret cabinet meeting where the Revolutionary Guards and the ministers and the security apparatus and the president are in a room having a discussion. And Ahmadinejad says that perhaps the best way to deal with these protesters is to actually give in to their demands and open up the country and give them greater freedoms and allow for openness and freedom of the press. And the response of the chief of staff of the Revolutionary Guard,
the commander
of the Revolutionary Guard, was to slap Ahmadinejad across the face. You add that to these other comments that we've been gathering from Ahmadinejad, in which he has said that women should not be harassed, there shouldn't be morality police, that that the state has no business telling couples that they can't, be intimate together. The attempts that he has made to remove the clerical establishment from positions of power. His statements that the Iranian government is too complicated for the clerics and the supreme leader to run.
Or to understand.
To understand, even. And then his statements and his attempts recently with his chief of staff, Mashai, to advance what he calls an Iranian agenda as opposed to an Islamic agenda. So here's this man who is actually kind of liberalizing, Persianizing, secularizing, internationalizing. Could it be that we got him wrong completely?
Well, I mean, it's a very good point. I would just say on the WikiLeaks disclosures when it comes to Iran, we have to take some of those disclosures with a grain of salt because they are the opinions of American diplomats or Iran watchers outside of Iran, or people who have contact with people in Iran. There's anonymous people, so we're not sure exactly.
Well, not this slapping one. I mean, it's
and
anonymous.
By the way, Iran,
it's anonymous.
Yeah, and
yes,
Iran denied that obviously denied that Jafari ever slapped the president in his face, although it's entirely possible. But I think that in a weird way, and this is counterintuitive, Ahmadinejad may be in the history of the Islamic Republic the greatest reformer of the Islamic Republic. And this is not to say that he's the greatest president or the greatest man in the Islam. It's just that his ideas and what he has tried to do in terms of reforming the system, which was really a theocracy, a complete theocracy. And nobody challenged that theocracy until Ahmadinejad came along. And I think that's part of his...
First man to be elected, first non-cleric to be elected
since
president
Rajai. Since
Rajai. 27
years ago, yeah. And he plays on that very much, that he's the anti-cleric in many ways. He's talked about how the clerics are not unlike, alluded to the fact that the clerics are not unlike the royalty of the Shah's era, where there's this system of power being shared among only a certain number of people. He plays on that very much, and he's basically made it his goal to kind of crack that in the Islam, and he's been somewhat successful. He gets away with it. He gets away with it in a way that no other Iranian president has, including, and like what you're saying in terms of his outreach to the United States, no Iranian president has ever dared say the things he has said about America, saying that I want to meet President Obama, I want to sit down with the president, I want to shake his hands. All these things are things that other presidents wouldn't dare say. The respect that they had for the clergy, for particularly the velayat faqih, which is the rule of the jurisprudence, and in other words,
the entire foundation of the Iranian
of
regime,
the Islam, exactly,
is that the clerics should be the rulers of society
in the absence of the
imam, the
12th imam. So he's challenged the order that is there, and I think that for people who know him and people who've met him, and people who've seen him, and I've seen him and his chief of staff, Mashai, who's hated by the clerics in Iran. When you talk to them and when you see them in private or even in a gathering, the ideas that they have, whether they really believe them or not is another question, are very liberalizing. Ahmadinejad has said on many occasions that he doesn't believe that men and women should be hassled on the street. Now, I think the reason you look at it today, Iran today, and you could argue as an Iranian who visits Iran and say, well, yeah, but now the hijab is much more strictly enforced under Ahmadinejad than it was under Khatami, and that is true. But that's not necessarily what Ahmadinejad wants. I think some of his supporters have said, look, we've put you in power, we've allowed you to do this, but in return, as conservatives, we expect you to do this. We expect you to allow this to happen. And he's actually battled some of those hardliners.
In fact, that was exactly the comment of Ayatollah Jannati, a very conservative Ayatollah in Iran,
ideologue, yeah,
who said quite openly to Ahmadinejad, it was the well-veiled people who voted for you,
yeah,
not the loosely veiled
yeah,
people. And that's something that you better remember. Now, is that true?
I think that the well-veiled as opposed to the mal-veiled. I love this word, mal-veiled. It's a new word in the English. The Iranian government uses it all the time. The mal-veiled people in Iran, and there are many, many mal-veiled people in Iran, including in holy cities like Qom. I think some of them voted for. I mean, I know some of them who middle-class mal-veiled people who voted for Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad is not as unpopular as we imagined him to be at the height of the protests, and that's not to say, I'm not saying he won by the margin he won the election. I don't want to get into the whole election thing. But he was never as unpopular as we in the West imagined, or some Iranians were hoping he was. There was always a pretty strong base of support. Obviously, we know Iran is in some ways like America. It's red state, blue state. And it's kind of, half and half. And in some years it might be a little bit more red. Some years it might be a little bit more blue. And also like America, like that famous book, What's the Matter with Kansas? Iranians also tend to vote against their own interests. So the rural poor tend to vote against their own interests. The middle class sometimes tends to vote against their own interests. So there are some similarities in that regard. But I think Ahmadinejad has quite a lot of support among certain segments of the middle class. There are a lot of people who just hate him for who he is. And, whether it's his, what he looks like. A lot of Iranians don't like the way he looks. How he speaks. And how he has, the way he speaks the way an ordinary, average, urban speaker in Iran.
Let me explain what Homan means by this. There are two Persians. There are two kinds of Persian language. There's colloquial, and then there's classical Persian. And all books, television, news, broadcasts, university education, it's all assumed that all speeches, it's assumed that all of that is done in classical Persian, which is a very flowery Persian, has a lot of Arabic words, a lot of Arabic influences in it. And then there's the Persian that everybody just speaks on the streets. As far as I know, I have never seen a national politician in Iran give speeches in colloquial Persian.
Not in 2,500 years.
I mean, it's that shocking. And just to understand what this means, so, you know, I mean, I came to America when I was 8 or 9 years old. I'm fluent in Farsi, certainly. But when I watch Khatami, whom you were very close to, and we can talk about that a little more. When I watch Khatami give a speech, I don't understand a word that's coming out of his mouth. I don't understand what he's saying. He might as well be speaking Japanese. I don't get it.
Yeah.
When I hear Ahmadinejad give a speech, it's like I'm listening to my dad speak. Yeah. I understand whatever he's saying, and that's true.
Your dad sounds cool
for a good. That's true for, I would say, 40 million Iranians.
Absolutely, nobody in the history of the Islamic Republic or in the history of Iran, as I was like half joking about it going back 2,500, has ever spoken the way he speaks. I mean, when he says things, like, and it appeals to a certain demographic, to a large,
like George Bush.
Well, exactly. It's also that.
No, I mean this quite seriously.
No,
what did people say about Bush as opposed to Gore? Bush, he sounds like someone I want to have a beer with.
Yeah. And Ahmadinejad sounds like somebody you want to have a kebab with, you know.
Tea with.
But Ahmadinejad, what's interesting about Ahmadinejad also is like he has played up. I mean, everybody remembers the John Kerry George Bush election in 2004, and the whole idea of John Kerry being this elitist, and Democrats being elitist, and then in the 2008 election here, Obama being an elitist. I mean, here's a guy, Obama being it's impossible to believe that Obama's an elitist, and yet that message stuck.
Harvard.
Yeah, he went to Harvard. Yeah, and his wife's an elitist because she went to Princeton, and the same thing applies in Iran to some degree. Right. Here's Ahmadinejad who plays on that all the time. The clerics, Khatami, those people are elitists. I'm just like you. I mean, he was kind of like the Christine O'Donnell of Iran. He was saying, you know...
He was a witch?
Perhaps.
Oh.
Perhaps. But I don't know if you remember the last Christine O'Donnell TV ad where at the end she said, "I am you." I mean, that was Ahmadinejad, "I am you." Yeah. And that appeals to a large segment of the population. I'm not going to say it's the majority of the population. I'm not going to say it's, you know, certainly we know for a fact it's not, even by the government's own statistics, it's not a majority of Tehran. They admit that Ahmadinejad did not win Tehran in the last election. So clearly in certain urban areas he's very unpopular for a lot of reasons. I mentioned the reason for him being, you know, speaking the way he speaks. He doesn't represent Iran in a good way. Iranians are very concerned about how we appear to the world, and for a lot of urban, educated, middle-class Iranians, Ahmadinejad gives off the worst impression. His beard is scraggly. He wears the worst suits.
Clothes,
he's just awful, you know.
But it's all on purpose.
Well, I think so, yeah. I think
I'm not saying it's not who he is, but it is where he gets his strength from. It's where he gets his popularity from, is the rumpled suits and the bad hair and the, you know, unkempt beard. That, I mean, do not confuse the outward sign for a bumpkin. He is
he's very
quite
smart.
Politically sophisticated.
He's very political.
Animal.
I mean, I was in Isfahan in about 3 weeks before the election, and I was going to
the 09 election.
09 election, and I was going. It was during the campaign season. I was going back to Tehran from Isfahan. It's about a 5-hour drive by car. You can fly, but we don't like to fly in domestic airlines in Iran. They tend to fall out of the sky.
They're like Russian planes.
Yeah.
They just...
So, or you can take the bus, and buses tend to crash and kill all 70 people aboard. So I usually just hire a taxi. Weird, a 5-hour drive costs only like about $50. So it's worth taking a taxi. I also like to talk to a cab driver, you know, from Isfahan to Tehran. It's always fun. So 3 weeks before the election, it was 9 o'clock in the morning. They called a taxi for me at my hotel. The guy shows up, and he looked a little drunk. But I realized he wasn't. You know, I may have been, but he wasn't. And I get in the car, and he's like rubbing his. I said, "Are you okay to drive?" He said, "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just really tired." I said, "Why are you so tired?" He said, "Well, I just got off duty." I said, "Well, you're on duty. You're taking." He said, "No, I got off my real job." I said, "What's your real?" He said, "I'm a cop." Mm-hmm. And I said, "Wow, okay." So I'd heard of people in Iran taking second jobs. I know people in Iran take third, fourth jobs, university graduates driving cabs and all that. But a cop I hadn't heard, an Isfahan cop. He said, "Yeah, we were just busting some drunks this morning, and that's basically what we do all night. We go around, we pick up drunks, and, you know, this and that." So we got into this long conversation. On the ride, I said, "You know, how long have you been doing this?" He said, "Well, you know, I can't afford to feed my family on my salary, on my policeman's salary, so this is what I do." And I said, "Well, how long have you been doing it?" He said, "About, 3 years." And I said, "So under Khatami's presidency, you weren't doing this. He said, no, I think things were a little bit better then. I said, so who are you going to vote for? He said, Ahmadinejad. And I said, but wait a second, you just told me things were a little bit better then. And he said, yeah, but things may have been better, but Ahmadinejad really means well. He really wants to take care of people like me. He really understands. He actually said, "Dard ma ro chiz mikone, dark mikone," which in Farsi means he understands our pain. And I think that message, we didn't see it so much here. Again, I think that there are many people in Iran. I can't give a statistic. I don't know. We will never know because polls aren't very accurate. But Ahmadinejad has a lot of appeal for people like him, like this policeman. Now, you could argue he's from the working class as a policeman, not from the middle class, but his kids are going to go to college. He was proud of that. He was proud of a lot of things in Iran. And he took great pride in this man who was like, you were contrasting it to George Bush, who kind of like is the guy he wanted to have a kebab with. He did not want to have a kebab with Khatami because he wouldn't understand a word of what Khatami said if he did have a kebab with him. So I think there is this counterintuitive thing with Ahmadinejad, and I think that clearly there are obstacles in his way. A lot of people have read, maybe people who are interested in Iran have read recently about the infighting in Iran, and a lot of the conservatives are against Ahmadinejad. But these are the reasons they're against him. They're against him because they do think he's going to try to break the power of the supreme leader. He's trying to go around the clerics in making decisions. He's obviously completely ignored the will of the supreme leader on many occasions in his first term as well as in his second term. But so there are many reasons that we may have gotten Ahmadinejad wrong. Now, that's not to say that Ahmadinejad does not have dictatorial tendencies, as was pointed out in the debates in the presidential debates, that he does, like many politicians, he wants to be the decider. He wants to be the guy who makes the calls and makes the decisions. He doesn't want to be subservient to anybody. He doesn't consider the parliament to have the authority that they do have. He doesn't consider the Expediency Council, all these Orwellian, Iranian political, and he doesn't consider any of them to have any power. He says, like you pointed out, Reza, that he says, I'm the president and I'm going to do this.
Yeah, he stopped, unlike every president before him, he stopped allowing his cabinet to meet with the Expediency Council, which is essentially the bridge between the elected government and the unelected supreme leaders and the clerical committees. The statements that he made about how this country is too complicated to be run by the supreme leader would immediately result in the execution of anyone else in Iran having said that statement. That is a crime punishable by death to say that statement, and yet this is the president saying it. And he's completely pissed off the parliament, which has tried to impeach him once we're certain of, but maybe as many times as twice over the last year alone. So what he's done is he's put this enormous amount of power all of a sudden in what was essentially a powerless office, the power of the president. Nevertheless, it brings up this larger issue, which is that while on the one hand it's true he has probably greater power and influence both with regard to domestic and foreign policy in Iran since any other president in the 30-year history of the Islamic Republic. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely.
At the same time, he's got that power at a time in which the ruling establishment is itself as fractured as it's ever been. Now, you and I disagree about the exact influence of the Revolutionary Guard. I think that the militarization of Iranian politics, which is a process that's been going on for more than a decade, really is a process that started when the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, took over as the faqih, the supreme leader, but has accelerated in profound ways. They are increasingly, 1/3 of the parliament is former members of the Revolutionary Guard. About $100 billion, that's a third of the annual budget of Iran, is directly or indirectly controlled by the Revolutionary Guard. Now, on top of that, of course, most of the privatized industries, those particularly that have been privatized over the last 4 or 5 years, have gone to members or companies or subsidiaries of the Revolutionary Guard, usually without any kind of bidding. And on top of this, now thanks to the so-called Green Movement, what is essentially meant to be an intelligence apparatus has also become a security apparatus, which, from my understanding of the Constitution of Iran, is unconstitutional. It seems to me, and again, it's a very opaque system. It's hard to know exactly who's calling the shots, but if we had heard that Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stood up in the middle of a security meeting and slapped Obama across the face for a suggestion that he made, that would be absurd. And yet we listen to an event like that in Iran and just kind of shrug our shoulders. That's a profound event that indicates that there is a level of control by this military security intelligence apparatus that I would say is unprecedented, that it's still not divorced from the religious establishment. That's not what I mean to say, that they are in control and they called the shots and the mullahs are nothing and the supreme leader has no say. They need the supreme leader because that's where they get their legitimacy from. But it's becoming harder to figure out who is pulling the strings. Who is the supreme leader manipulating the Revolutionary Guard, or is the Revolutionary Guard manipulating the supreme leader? I'm of the latter opinion. You're of the former opinion.
Yeah. I think if Aziz Jafari, who's the commander of this Revolutionary Guards, had slapped the supreme leader across the face, I think we would have been. That would be the equivalent of Mike Mullen slapping President Obama. I think that it's, as usual with Iran, it's a lot more complex, a lot more complicated than one would imagine. I don't disagree that the Revolutionary Guards have a tremendous amount of influence. But when we talk about the Revolutionary Guards, and this is something that's repeated in the media here many times, well, half of the parliament are former Revolutionary Guardsmen or from the Revolutionary Guards. We always talk about it as if they're still in the Revolutionary Guards. And it's like saying, half of the members of Congress served in the U.S. Army at a time when, there's compulsory, if there had been compulsory service in America, when there was compulsory service in America. The fact of the matter is a lot of people served in the Revolutionary Guards in Iran and have done over the years. The mayor of Tehran is a former guardsman, former commander at the Guards. He's no longer in the Guards. He has a lot of friends in the Guards. He has a lot of influence. He's a military man. He hasn't been in the Guards for 10 years, more. Mohsen Rezai, who was one of the conservative candidates challenging President Ahmadinejad, former commander of the Guards, but he's no longer in the Guards. So I think when we talk about the Guards, sometimes we talk about it. First of all, when you get drafted in Iran, when you're 18, you have to go serve, or after college you get deferments. You can serve either in the Guards or in the army. If you were in Iran and you didn't plan on traveling too much outside of Iran, you would pick the Revolutionary Guards. And when I say that about traveling is because a lot of the Revolutionary Guards get sanctioned by America and they can't travel. So those people who have ideas of immigrating will not serve in the Guards. But a lot of other people will look around and say, the Guards, I know people who've done this.
Plush job.
It's a much more plush job. And they get to go home and they get to wear the Guards uniform. They get a lot of respect. It's an elite military organization. And so people do serve in the Guards. And then some of them stay in the Guards for a few years, or some of them go into the private sector of the Guards. And you're right, they do control a lot of the economy. But I think it's exaggerated a little bit in terms of it's the Guards that are running. It's not quite like a military, the militarization of a place like Burma, for example. It's a different thing. It's a little bit more complex. And a lot of the Guards have different political
certainly
opinions. I mean, we have looked at, and we know statistically that the Guards have generally voted in the same way that the population has, whether they voted for a reformist like Khatami or they voted for Rafsanjani. In the case of Aziz Jafari, it's also important to remember the president of Iran is not the commander-in-chief, right, unlike in America. So he has no authority over the army or the Revolutionary Guards. Theoretically, he can't fire them, he can't appoint them, he can't do anything with the army. Ahmadinejad likes to stand up at military parades and, he never disputes the fact that he was a Revolutionary Guard, whereas he actually was never a Revolutionary Guardsman himself. He was actually in the Basij during the war, and he was never on the front line. I know Iranian Revolutionary Guards who are really pissed off that he pretends like, not pretends, but he kind of doesn't deny that he was in the Revolutionary Guards.
Basij is the paramilitary sort of volunteer force.
Volunteer force, yes. And they're the ones who were responsible for a lot of the brutality.
They're attached to the Guard, but they are
They are now attached to the Guards. They weren't always, but now they're under the command of the Guards. But, you know, it's, as I said, it's very complex in Iran. Rafsanjani, who is an absolute, you know, enemy of Ahmadinejad and has been ever since he lost the election to him in 2005, it was Rafsanjani who was the mentor to Aziz Jafari, who is the current commander of the Revolutionary Guards. And then they're from the same town, well, not the same town. Jafari's from Yazd. He's from Rafsanjan, but they're very close cities. And this is a man who was went into the Guards in his teens, and he grew up in the military. He's a military man. He is going to follow the orders of his commander-in-chief, in my opinion. And the commander-in-chief is Ayatollah Khamenei. Now, I agree with you that it's a little opaque, and it's hard to say with any certainty that is it Ayatollah Khamenei who's calling all the shots. Well, clearly not, because Ahmadinejad sometimes does things that we know the Supreme Leader disapproves of. Or is it the Guards that are calling all the shots? I don't think the Guards are organized in that way to call all the shots. I think they do take their cue from the office of the Supreme Leader. I think, as you pointed out correctly, their entire legitimacy is based on the Velayat Faqih, and they wouldn't exist without that. I mean, they are the guardians of the Islamic Revolution, not of the Islamic Republic. So I think it's a complex thing, and I think, you know, it's funny with the Guards. I mean, there are plenty of Iranians and people that you wouldn't actually would think this way. You know, Tehran Airport, when the new airport was built, this is a famous story. Some of you may not be aware of it. It was under Khatami's rule that the new Tehran airport was built. It's a very modern airport with a Turkish consortium. Khatami goes, he opens the airport. Within 2 hours, the Revolutionary Guards come and close it down. And on the basis that it was a national security threat to have a foreign company involved in the operation of Tehran's airport, because all of Tehran's airports are both military airports and civilian airports.
And now who runs the administration?
And all the concessions at Tehran's airport are run by the Revolutionary Guards. So there's a lot of money involved.
So however, if you're in Tehran, the food court
is yes, the food court.
At the
well, one of my friends actually owns one of the cappuccino places at the Tehran airport, and he says he's never had better partners than the Guards. But it was interesting. Somebody that is very much against this regime, isn't even a Muslim, but lives in Iran and is Iranian, said to me, well, you know, when I was talking about the Revolutionary Guards, exactly this conversation I was having in Tehran 6 months ago, he said, but, you know, Homan, when you come through Imam Khomeini Airport, don't you think it's a better experience than going through Mehrabad? I said, sure, it's a nicer airport, it's cleaner, the gates are better and all that. He said, no, I don't mean that. I mean immigration and customs. How easy is it now compared to what it was? And I said, you're right, it's much easier. They never ask you any questions, customs, they don't hassle you, they're very polite. He said it's because of the Guards. If it wasn't for the Guards, they want to make sure that that airport is run super efficiently. So there are people who support, in some cases, support the Guards' involvement in these businesses because they're actually run better than if the bureaucracy, the regular bureaucracy of Tehran ran it. So these are the things that we don't really see on a day-to-day basis. We know the Guards are scary.
What we're talking about, however, is that there is a seemingly pretty obvious transfer of power taking place. If we were having this discussion a decade ago, we would say that the vast majority of the parliament are people with turbans on.
Yes.
And yet now we're saying the majority are people who either very recently were or in the past were members of a particular organization, the Revolutionary Guard, which you write is quite a vast organization, but from what I understand makes up about 250,000
tops,
individuals.
About 200,000,
in a country of 77 million. If we were having this conversation 10 years ago, we'd say that most of the private industry is owned by people with turbans. You know, they're the ones who are growing rich. They're the ones in the giant palaces in North Tehran, right? On the base of the Alborz mountain.
And that's what Ahmadinejad rails against all the time. Yeah.
Except now, the people in those mansions are people who are either, very recently removed from the Guards, or who are there because of their business dealings with the Guards.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we are
you can sell a lot of cappuccinos at the airport.
Yes. Yeah. We are seeing former military men muscle out religious men in the economic, the political, and the social sectors of Iran. We're not talking about Burma yet, in which the military is the actual, the government.
The ruling establishment, yeah.
We're not talking about that yet. But we are talking about Pakistan, where, yes, there is a civilian government. Sure, there's a president, there's a prime minister, but really, the decision-making is, if not heavily influenced, maybe even I would go so far as to say made by the military. Iran's not there yet, but it's heading there very, very quickly. And I think that the moment in which we figure out what kind of Iran is we're going to see in the immediate future is what happens when Khamenei dies. Now, Khamenei has been there for 20 years. You're right, the relationship between the Guard and Khamenei is symbiotic. Khamenei can't make his will, he can't impose his will on Iran without the Guards. And the Guards exist solely because they are the personal militia of Khamenei. But Khamenei dies, and now we have to replace him. Forget the fact that we're now 3 removed from Khomeini, the guy who invented the job of supreme leader for himself. We are now at a point in which those clerics who are essentially most likely to rise to that position are clerics whose policies may not necessarily be in alignment with the leadership of the Guard. And at that point, we talk about this proverbial tipping point. I think that we're getting closer to that tipping point. I don't think that Iran is a military dictatorship. And yes, I do believe that you can exaggerate the role of the military. But what we are seeing is a creeping militarization of every aspect of Iranian society, from where the money goes to where the votes go, to where to who actually makes the decisions in this country. And I don't think that it's an exaggeration to say that Iran is becoming. It's not there yet, but it's becoming a military state. In the sense that you could have said 10 years ago that it's a clerical state.
I mean, it's a good point. I think that's a very good point specifically in terms of contrasting between the power of the clerics and the power of the clergy and the power of the military today. But I would still say, I mean, I would still disagree that it's close. I would say that the military has a lot more influence today than it did 10, 15 years ago. And if people like Ahmadinejad are around and have their way, and if the next president of Iran is also a layman, not from the clergy, I think you'll continue to see that, because the likelihood is that if the next president of Iran is also a layman like Ahmadinejad, he will also have been in the Revolutionary Guards. Here you've got people like Larijani being touted as a possible replacement. You've got Ghalibaf. These are both former commanders of the Guards. So you've got, again, the former Guardsmen potentially becoming president. So yes, I do see that. I do see that aspect of it. But I don't know what, I mean, it's impossible. It's pure speculation to say what will happen when Khamenei dies or when he is incapacitated as supreme leader, whichever. We still have the Assembly of Experts, which has more conservatives on it in the body than, and this is a body that's elected by the people of Iran to monitor the performance of the supreme leader, to choose a supreme leader, and to potentially even impeach him if they feel that he's not doing his job. And there's rumors that can't be confirmed that Rafsanjani, after the election of 2009, tried to get support from many of the members of the Assembly of Experts to, in fact, try to put pressure on Khamenei to either threaten him with impeachment so that he would overturn the election, or actually to impeach him, and he wasn't able to gather that support. But there are plenty of clerics on that. I mean, it's hard to say what's going to happen, whether there will be one person who will be elected as supreme leader, or whether there will be a council of 3, right, which is something that's been talked about.
The Constitution of Iran
But I agree with you.
A council of 3 or a council of 5.
Yeah, but I don't disagree with you that certainly when Khamenei dies, when the Assembly of Experts meets to pick and assuming that everything, if regime change hasn't happened by then, assuming that it's still Iran is what it is, I have no doubts that people in the Assembly of Experts will be conferring with the Revolutionary Guard senior commanders to get a sense of,
who's acceptable.
Well, who's the most, who's comfortable for them, but again, I know some of the top senior commanders in the guards, not necessarily Aziz Jafari himself, but there are other commanders, senior commanders of the guards, who are very, very close to some of the reformers in Iran, very close to some of the people who are now considered in the Green Movement. I don't necessarily mean Karoubi, but certainly some of the Khatami people. And so there are plenty there. So I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen. It would be pure speculation. But I think we also have to bear in mind the atmosphere that is the political atmosphere in Iran among the leadership, where they do really believe they're under threat. They're under a threat of attack, military attack. They're under the threat of sabotage, assassinations, anything to subvert the Islamic Republic. And under those conditions, certainly the Revolutionary Guards, that's the argument they've been making, is what you pointed out was unconstitutional, their involvement in domestic security, which it is unconstitutional, technically speaking. But they're saying that it's not unconstitutional because
they're in a state of war. They're in a state of
the Islamic
threat.
Republic, we are the guardians of the revolution. If the revolution is under threat, whether it's under threat internally, externally, or there's foreign hands trying to subvert the Islamic system here or overthrow the system, we are the guardians. We're the ones who are supposed to protect it. So we will do everything we can. And there are people who really believe, we may not think that Obama will bomb Iran. We may not think that Netanyahu will wake up one day and say, you know what, this is what I think is going to be fun to do today. We may not think that's a possibility, but people in Tehran do. They actually do think that's a way.
I mean, this is I think. So far we've praised Ahmadinejad and we've praised the Revolutionary Guard.
We're doing our jobs.
So we're
as
doing our
agents
job
of the
as
Islamic
agents
Republic.
of the Islamic Republic. We've done well.
I hope we have evidence here somewhere.
And now let's excuse Iran's nuclear program.
Yes, let's excuse it.
Both Homan and I are adamant in our belief that everything has to be done to keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, because we cannot abide by the proliferation of nuclear arms anywhere in the world, but particularly in the Middle East. But not because we think that Iran is an irrational actor, and the first chance that they get, the minute they build a nuclear bomb, they're going to commit collective suicide, all 70 million Iranians, by launching it at Israel, which is,
and kill 4 million Palestinians.
And to kill 4 million Palestinians, which, as we all know, the Israeli government would turn the entire nation of Iran into glass. And the Iranians know this. But it doesn't change the calculus, which I think Homan brought up very well, which is what we don't ever ask ourselves is, why is it that Iran is actually pursuing a nuclear weapon? And there's very few people who don't think that they're pursuing a nuclear weapon. At the least, perhaps they're pursuing nuclear latency, by which we mean they're going to enrich uranium to the point where they can weaponize it in a hurry if need be, but they will stop there. Most analysts would say that that's pretty much the same thing as having a nuclear weapon. But regardless, what we don't ask is why. Why? And again, from our perspective, we see Iran as overly paranoid, constantly talking about plots to overthrow the government. Geez, I wonder why they would think that. Constantly talking about, forces, whether it's the United States or whether it's Great Britain or whether it's Israel, whose agents are in Iran working to undermine the government. Again, it's absolutely true. Those three countries have agents in Iran actively working to undermine the government, if not explicitly assassinating members of the Iranian military hierarchy, or the nuclear scientists, high-placed nuclear scientists. We had a coordinated attack that took place less than a month ago, which has all the hallmarks of a Mossad attack. This isn't accusatory. I mean, to be honest, most Israelis that I speak to
are happy about it.
Yeah. They're like, that's right. That's right. Did you see that? Did you see that? Coordinated. 2 motorcycles, 2 bombs, done. They're very proud of it. It's not, by any means, anti-Israeli or anti-Semitic to say that there are Mossad agents in Iran assassinating people. The Israelis are very proud of it, as we've said.
Yeah.
But you add all of that together, and it makes it very easy to understand why a regime like Iran would want nuclear weapons. It's, as I've said numerous times, encircled by American troops. We know that there are some 50 to 100 nuclear weapons in Israel right now, as we sit here, pointed at Tehran. And a regime that, who's blustering about the Iranian threat very clearly parallels and equals. By the way. Yeah, since 1984, very equally, parallels the blustering of the Iranian regime about the Israeli threat. And as I always sort of mention, to people, Iran sort of looks around in the region at all the other nuclear-powered states: Israel, India, Pakistan, all of whom have nuclear weapons outside. Pakistan has received nearly $20 billion in the last decade from the United States, despite its nuclear program. Israel, we have spent billions of dollars shielding Israel's program from the IAEA. And of course, India, which, in direct violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we ourselves wrote, Sentence 1 of Article 1 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty says no signatory of this treaty may engage in nuclear trade with a non-signatory of this treaty. We just signed a multi-billion-dollar nuclear trade deal with India.
But George Bush doesn't have to abide by any treaties.
Obama was just as happy to sign that treaty.
To sign it, yeah.
So Iran looks around, and like any teenager, recognizes that it's always easier to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. So let's just build it. People will cause a stink. They'll get mad. They'll get angry. Things will get a little bit tough for a while, and then they'll just forget about it, like they did with India and Israel and Pakistan and North Korea, and then we'll just be accepted as a nuclear state. So why not build it? Why not?
Why not have the capability? I actually don't think there's been a decision made at any level in the Iranian government to actually build a bomb. I think that the Iranians don't want to be. The Iranians are well aware that, as you pointed out, Mossad has agents in Iran. They're well aware that there's plenty of intelligence on the Iranian program. They're well aware that they have the possibility of secretly building a bomb somewhere, testing it, or at least having some idea that it's going to work. It's not North Korea. It's very difficult to do that in Iran without getting caught. And, the supreme leader doesn't want to end up being a supreme liar. He has said many, many times we're not doing it. He said he's issued a fatwa against it.
That's right.
For him to suddenly be caught, like the Israelis, for example, the Israeli intelligence showing that Iran actually has a developed bomb or is being developed, I think is at this point they don't need, as you pointed out, they don't need to do that. I think they understand that having the fuel cycle means that they could be, as Gary Sick once said, a long weekend away from building a bomb, and I think that's an advantage. I would say, I would agree with you 100% that the Iranian, the very worst, most uneducated, most ideological, most conservative mullah in Iran, if he had his fingers on the bomb, on the button for an atomic bomb, I would still be more comfortable than the Pakistanis having a nuclear weapon. That's my personal opinion.
Why?
I think the Pakistani nuclear weapons are dangerously unsecure. I think we think that they're very secure because we have an allied government. They promise to be, that they're secure and all that. But the Pakistani military, talking about Pakistan as a military, the Pakistani military is notorious for having ideologues who are nihilistic. These are people who support Al-Qaeda. They actively support Al-Qaeda. And the most ideological, most conservative, most wacko mullah in Iran does not. And they're much more, it was in Iran that I was told by a mullah, not even like an ayatollah, who told me about, but Israel has a second strike capability. So they're sophisticated enough to know about first strike, second strike, and all that. I said, we're not going to build a bomb. We're not going to drop it on Israel. We're not going to. They have second. They understand that what Israel's capability is, as you pointed out, to turn Iran into glass. So I think they're realistic, and they're realistic in terms of, I'm not saying there aren't people in Iran, some very sophisticated, by the way, people who are against Ahmadinejad for purely nationalistic reasons. I've heard this from Iranians inside Iran and even Iranians here who hate Ahmadinejad and hate this government, hate this regime. It's like, why shouldn't we have a bomb? If the Pakistanis have it, I mean, you know, Iranians, we're not only tend to be a little bit racist, but we're also very, you know, we're very proud and we're superior to every other race. And so if this race, if the Indians and the Pakistanis, who, by the way, the Persian Empire once ruled, if they have nuclear weapons, why the hell shouldn't we have? Why
I hear this all the time. If the Pakistanis have a bomb,
yeah,
you know, you hear this all the time. Like, ugh,
yeah, you know, the upper class of Pakistan speak Farsi. They, you know,
that's right.
They love our language so much they learn Farsi so they can read the Shahnameh. And they, you know, they try to marry Iranian women because they know our women are prettier than theirs.
Oh no.
Benazir Bhutto. I'm sorry. This is not me saying this. I mean, well, maybe it is, but it's also. But you know, Benazir Bhutto is half Persian. I mean, you know, so
no, but the point.
But the idea is that there's a nationalistic trend here as well in Iran, that there are people who will say, why shouldn't we have a bomb, regardless of the regime, regardless of the regime. Now, of course, people who are very opposed to the regime say, yeah, we should have a bomb, but not with this regime. You know, we would love Reza Pahlavi to have a bomb, you know, or we would love, you know, so-and-so to have a bomb, or Mousavi to have a personal little bomb, you know, if they're Mousavi supporters. Or if Khatami had a bomb, then everything would be fine. He's such a nice man. He would never use it, you know.
Yeah.
So it depends on who you're, but there is a nationalistic thing about and also, you know, telling us that you can't have this. For Iranians, you know, America's saying you can't have this technology. You're not allowed to have this enrichment technology when, you know, all these other, you know, lesser countries. I mean, no Iranian thinks of India as being a greater power than Iran.
Right.
I mean, you know, it is a greater power than Iran, but no Iranian will ever admit to that.
Yeah, actually, you said that. I remember something that Bush said in 06, 07, where, you know, he went from, we can't allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and it was a slight change. I'm not sure if anybody else noticed it, but he started saying, we cannot allow Iran to have the knowledge to develop a nuclear weapon. And I thought, wait, what? I don't understand. Like, I mean, you know, basically a PhD in physics knows how to make a nuclear weapon.
Well, it's on the internet.
And what are you gonna? It's all, yeah. And what exactly are you planning on doing? Like opening up their skulls and removing that knowledge?
No, assassinating their scientists.
Yeah, is killing them all. All right, so we hit the greatest hits: Ahmadinejad, the Revolutionary Guard, and nukes. And now what we'd like to do is open it up to everyone else. There's a mic somewhere coming down. So please wait for the mic. Where can the person with the mic, can you raise your hand? Oh, there you are. Okay, great. So how about right there? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, thank you. Wait. I'm sorry.
Yeah, wait for the mic, please. And please ask a question. Don't give a speech. We all got to get out of here by 8:30.
Ask you a question. Unless you mentioned it in the first 15 minutes, you haven't talked about madrasas. Now, I may be ignorant about things, but Osama bin Laden needs suicide bombers, and I understand that they're trained to be ultimate believers in Islam, including committing suicide. So what about the madrasas?
There are no madrasas in Iran, and there's never been such a thing as an Iranian suicide bomber. So this is a I mean, I'm not saying there are no sort of fanatics and radicals and fundamentalists in Iran, just not the Al-Qaeda type. No problem. No problem.
Well, we are in the Middle East,
yeah,
but we think we're in Europe.
Yeah, sure. The other thing too, by the way, you know, Iran doesn't.
It's an accident of geography. Persians aren't Middle Eastern. We're like the French.
The reason, like, it's true, yeah. The reason, like in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, you see the madrasa system is because the national government doesn't support education, mandatory education. In Iran, public education is mandatory. The literacy rate for women, just women in Iran, is 89%. So.
And that's not to say that there aren't theology classes in public education. Of course there are, but they're not teaching them to strap bombs to themselves.
Anybody on this side? Oh, yes, right there, ma'am, in the back.
Can you tell us a little bit about the contemporary literary scene in Iran?
There is a contemporary literary scene. And there's, you know, hundreds of publishers, and there's hundreds of novels and nonfiction books that come out every year. They hardly ever get translated into other languages. Rarely, but sometimes they do. There are all kinds of novels and stories published every year. My Farsi isn't good enough to read a book in Farsi, but you know, there is young people older writers are writing poetry. Now, obviously there is censorship, so much like Iranian cinema, you tend to find things that are kind of like obtuse. You don't, there aren't going to be direct references to, crossing certain red lines that are there's self-censorship on the parts of the authors. There's censorship on the part of the publishing house that will submit the manuscript to the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance, and they'll get permission to publish it. So much like Iranian cinema, they have to be very careful about what they say. But there are ordinary, there's like, the equivalent of a Danielle Steele novel for, a lot of women will read in Iran. I've seen them, and people do buy them, and they do read them.
Also, a lot of books in English. You go to a bookstore, you
see a lot of books in English,
English books.
And George Bush's autobiography is available in Tehran. Hillary Clinton's is available in Tehran in English, and then translated. Hillary's I've seen in Farsi as well. So there's a pretty vibrant, there's a Tehran book fair. You should go.
In the back over there, sir.
What are your observations about the tension between Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims, and what are your perspectives as how that will play out?
It's a very good question. I think with regard to geopolitics, it's not necessarily Sunni and Shia, it's Persian and Arab. Now, it turns out that, that does often mean the same thing. The Sunni-Shia divide, of course, it's 1,400 years. I mean, the best way that I could sort of describe it, and the fastest way that I could describe it, is very much like Catholics and Protestants. There are some Protestants who believe that the Pope is the whore of Babylon, and there are some Catholics who believe that all Protestants, speak in tongues and drink poison.
Yeah, look at Northern Ireland.
Yeah, and that hatred is there. But for the most part, most people of Christian persuasion would say, well, these are just two ways of thinking about the same thing. Same is true about Islam. However, in the geopolitical realm, because Iran as this great Shia power is this very large, very powerful, sort of mini superpower in the Middle East, it has always, since the days of the Shah, this is not just, in the Islamic Republic, it's always butted up against the Arab powers, particularly in the Gulf. So, when we saw this WikiLeaks report in which it turns out that, the king of Saudi Arabia and, the various emirs in the Gulf would love nothing more than to have, Israel and the United States bomb Iran to oblivion, it was treated as though it was newsworthy somehow. It's a surprise to people that King Abdullah would like America to bomb Iran. It'd be like Christmas for him.
Yeah.
If he celebrated Christmas, which he does. And so that animosity is about what all these geopolitical animosities are about: economic, national security interests, things like that. The Iranian, particularly the Persian Arab divide, goes way beyond just the Islamic Republic of Iran in the last 30 years. Maybe a little bit closer up front. All the mic people are over at the end here. So how about this lady right here? We haven't heard from him.
Hi. I was wondering, what percentage of the population do you think belongs to the middle class, and what elements do you look at to measure that?
Very good question.
It's a very good. Beats me. Percentage-wise, I don't know. I mean, that's a very hard question. I don't think people really. I don't think there's anybody who really knows exactly what the percentage is in Iran. Obviously, it depends on what you define as the middle class. And in big cities, there's a pretty large percentage of a middle class, which make up civil society, which make up the potential for change, longer-term change. The middle class has been squeezed by sanctions more recently, by new sanctions, and they might be in danger of falling into the working class or the lower classes. But I mean, Iran's always had a pretty. I mean, this happened under the Shah. And to give credit where credit is due, there was definitely a burgeoning of a middle class under the Shah, and that extended into the Islamic Republic. What happened under the Islamic Republic is people who were formerly considered working class became the middle class, and the middle class that existed before became Los Angelinos. But and in some cases, San Francisco and Washington.
Can I also say, but we have to sort of redefine what we mean by middle class,
Yeah.
because in the United States, when we say the middle class, we traditionally used to mean the leisure class,
Yes.
right? When we say middle class in Iran, what we mean is, for instance, our families. My
Yeah.
cousin, my
Yeah.
cousin is middle class, by which I mean he is a software engineer who raises chickens and sells fake Louis Vuitton purses out of the back of his car. And then on
Give
the
me
weekends,
his address next time I go.
And then
We're
on
looking
the
for a
on the
good fake.
weekends, if he can do it, he drives Eastern European tourists all around the country. That's middle class in Iran.
Yeah, and doctors and lawyers and the professional class have become actually quite wealthy and are considered the upper class. But yeah, there's plenty of, the university graduates. Iran turns out 2 million graduates a year, some ridiculous number of university graduates who you would consider middle class. And some of them get jobs. And of course, Iran's government is the biggest employer in Iran by far. And most government officials or most government workers would consider themselves middle class, even though they're financially strapped, and like Reza says, they might have a second job, a third job, or a fourth job. So it's hard to define exactly what the middle class. But if you're talking about an educated, college-educated class, relatively sophisticated, they have satellite television, a lot of them speak English, they speak sometimes multiple languages, have traveled at a minimum to the Persian Gulf states, some places like Turkey if they haven't gone to Europe. If you're talking about that kind of middle class, on a pure income level, it's hard to say because we don't really have those statistics. And as we both pointed out, people have to sometimes work 3 or 4 jobs. So tough question. Sorry it took so long to answer it, and we didn't really answer it.
Can we get a little bit sort of more in the middle? I feel like I'm ignoring the middle crowd here.
The middle class. The middle class is
How about
being
that lady
ignored.
right there that you just walked by, and then?
You alluded earlier to the fact that a lot of Iranians vote against their own interests. Can you perhaps elaborate on that and also speak to, what I think was the naivete that led to the Ayatollah Khomeini? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, on the latter subject, I'm not sure what you mean. I will say this, that the idea that the 79 revolution was an Islamic revolution is a lie. That is post-revolutionary propaganda. This was an anti-imperialist revolution that involved almost every sector of Iranian society: Muslims, Jews, Christians, communists, Marxists, social democrats, the intellectuals, the conservative clerics, the liberal clerics. Everyone took part in this revolution. But the unifying voice of the revolution, whether you were a Marxist or whether you were a fundamentalist, was Khomeini. And although, with hindsight, all one has to do is read Khomeini's writings in the 60s and you know exactly what he was planning. It's very clear what he had in mind. The concept of Vilayat al-Faqih was not invented in 1979, it was invented in 1964. Yeah. And if you read his writings, you knew exactly what he wanted. But the problem is that he's such an enigmatic figure that when asked, what is it that you want, he wouldn't answer. Or he would say, I just want to go home. I just want to be left alone. I just want to be left with my books. And the intellectuals around him, people like Bani Sadr, these guys, who became his spokespersons, were heroes of the sort of anti-imperialist intellectual left. And if they were saying, hey, listen, I'm hanging out with Khomeini, he's cool, he's okay, we'll let him be the unifying voice to get the Shah out. But once the Shah leaves, then we'll create a provisional government, which is precisely what they did. We'll begin the process of writing a democratic constitution, which is precisely what they did. But of course, Khomeini had no intention of going back home and just minding his own business. So I don't think that it's sort of gullibility. I just think that people took him and his representatives at their words, and they were mistaken.
And I think, and just to add to that, I think like every politician in the world, why would we expect? I don't think it's naivete to believe a politician. Whoever you're voting for, I believed President Obama when he said he was going to shut down Guantanamo. Am I disappointed that he didn't? Yes. But do I think he was lying when he said it? Was I naive to believe that Guantanamo was going to be shut, or that this, and this wasn't going to happen? Or if you're conservative, you're going to believe your candidate's going to do this. So in the case of Khomeini, as Reza pointed out, he did certainly come across differently than how he behaved after the revolution. But he said things like in Paris that why wouldn't you believe? He said, I'm not going to run the government of Iran. I'm going to go back to Qom. I'm going to let the government to be run by professionals. And in fact, that's exactly what he did when he went
for
to
8 months.
Yeah, and then whether it was his decision or whether his advisors or other clerics or ideologues came to him and said, "Look, we're going to lose this revolution if we, the Marxists, the Mujahideen, these people are going to take over and they're going to sideline us unless we do this, this, and this." Whether it was advisors or he decided or it was always a plan, I don't know. But I mean, I don't think it was really naivete. I think people wanted to get rid of I think the vast majority of Iranians at that point were happy that the Shah was being pushed out, and that was the one avenue that was available to them was Khomeini, and they did. I think we didn't answer the second part of the question, which I've forgotten what it was.
I forgot the...
Oh, vote against. I think it's much like it is in America in terms of voting against. I mean, what I meant by that was that the economic plans. I'm not an economist. I'm not a scholar. I don't want to speak as an economist. But from what I understand from economists and people who know that the economic plans, for example, that Mousavi had, which would have been following basically many of Khatami's plans and Rafsanjani's plans, were more sane. These subsidies, for example, right now, we've heard about these subsidies being removed, and that's important, and it should happen, and that's necessary. But the way that it's being done is being criticized by a lot of very esteemed economists in Iran, because it's not tenable to have 80,000 tumans or $80 a month put into people's accounts forever. I mean, you can't. I mean, it's true that fuel subsidies and gasoline and electricity subsidies benefit the rich as much more than they benefit the poor. So ultimately, it's the right decision to get rid of these subsidies. But the way it's being done is not necessary. But people will go. People will vote for that 80,000 tuman in their bank account. People will vote for that $80 a month, and that's not necessarily in their interest. And it's the same as it is here because people don't think.
Yeah, that's what Bush did in 2000. He said, "Vote for me, and I'll give you everyone $250."
And people did it. Yeah. And we all got our check from the IRS.
Yeah.
And the way Obama did it, which was for all of us to get like $3 a week in our paychecks. Nobody
automatically
noticed.
Without anyone knowing,
but
which
nobody
is the
noticed,
smart thing to do.
Which is why 70% of Americans think that there was a tax hike under Obama and not a tax cut. So I think that's what it is. It's not saying that people are stupid, although some of them are, including myself. I vote against my own interests all the time because I don't understand some of the issues. This is just the way it is, unfortunately.
On this side? Can we just get maybe this lady right here?
Mr. Majd, your future books, actually in your previous book, Ayatollah Begs to Differ, Mrs. Sadouri suggested that you write about Kazem Assa.
Yes.
Will you? Well, I know it's not in the same line of your writing, but it could be.
It could be, yes. It's a very good question. Yes, the answer to that is yes. I will have to spend a lot more time in Tehran if I don't end up in Evin. Although, actually, if I end up in Evin, it might be an easy place to do it. I'll have a lot of time on my hand. I don't know if the library has my grandfather's books, but I maybe be able to arrange to have them brought there. But yes, I do intend to spend, for my next books, a lot of time in Iran, and I hopefully will be able to write about my grandfather in a way to reach an audience that he's never reached.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Why don't we just get that gentleman, too, while you're there?
We have time for one more question.
Okay, one more after this one. I feel like I need to get back to this side and maybe the front.
So if what you're saying is true and we take the old adage of the enemy of my enemy, why hasn't Ahmadinejad become a friend of the U.S. or?
Well, I mean, there's one thing and one thing only. It's the nuclear program. I mean, of which he's hawkish about, though I think he's certainly, as we've seen, more willing to accommodate the concerns of the Western powers than many other decision makers in Iran who obviously seem to hold sway. I mean, it's also the bluster, you know, the rhetoric. I think it's true. I mean, Homan is right. He's not unpopular in Iran, though I will say that he is far more unpopular today than he was 18 months ago.
Sure.
And it's because of the economy. It's a huge role to play with it. And the subsidies. I mean, the subsidies, yes, he is personally doling out, you know, $40, $80 for households. But, you know, people are waking up to their electricity bills jumping about 1,000% because of his, and certainly the new round of sanctions, which are directly tied to, you know, his leadership in many ways, has hurt Iranians. So he's far less popular than he was before. But at the same time, he's sort of become this kind of pan-Islamic leader. He's the new Nasser. You know, and I would say he is far more popular outside of Iran in the Middle East than he is inside of Iran. Outside of Iran, people love Ahmadinejad. Yes, it's true that the king of Saudi Arabia would like to bomb Iran, but every Saudi, you know, underneath the king thinks Ahmadinejad's the greatest thing that they've ever seen.
And every cab driver in New York thinks he's the greatest thing. Every time I go to the airport and they ask me where I'm going or, you know, where my name's from, and I say Iran, I just get an earful.
Like,
Ahmadinejad's fantastic. He's fantastic.
Why?
I mean, of course, most cab drivers in New York are Muslim.
He's a man who stands in the UN Assembly and says things that are absolutely true, but which no one else dares to say. For instance, when he says, what's the point of this body when the people who created this body don't actually have to follow the rules that they themselves wrote? Yeah, good point. Nobody else, except for Gaddafi, and he's nuts, nobody else says that. You know, does Hosni Mubarak say that? Does King Abdullah say something like that? Of course not. You know, does Hafez Assad say anything like that? Not even he would dare say something like that. And so from you know, whether you're in Venezuela or in Colombia or in you know, Cairo or wherever, you hear that and you think, I mean, yeah, this guy, he's got a point. And so that's sort of his popularity, and that makes him a troubling figure, you know, in the United States, and you know, our interests aren't served in promoting that.
That's all very true, but I do think that part of the reason that he has said on many occasions that he is a friend of the United States. He wants to be a friend of the United States. His chief of staff said he's a friend of Israel, so that's which got him into trouble. He's a friend of the Israeli people. He did get in trouble, yeah.
But
I think he does want to be. I think he's said it many times. Every time he comes to New York, he says he wants to meet with American officials. He goes to council. He goes to Columbia University, says there are no gays or whatever. That may be crazy to us and insane to us, but he's trying to actually reach. He really wants to do things to make himself, you know, the person who is the partner with America in bringing these 30 years of animosity to an end. But I think, you know, we're contributing a little bit. I mean, we have to look at the American government too and how we have reacted to him, and I understand why we react the way we react to him. And he's not the ideal partner for an American. It's hard for an American president to sit down and, you know, break bread with someone who denies the Holocaust. It becomes actually probably politically impossible. And that's very hard for, I think, Ahmadinejad to understand. But I think he does want to. And why hasn't Iran become friends? I mean, because, you know, there are certain things that we still have a mindset that we should be able to dictate things the way they should be, the way we want them to be in the Middle East. And Iran has said for 30 years now, said that's just not going to happen that way. We don't necessarily want to be your enemy, but we're just not automatically going to do what you want. And that's a fundamental problem. I think it was Stephen Kinzer who just wrote recently in I think in The Guardian, even today or maybe yesterday, about how the mindset of the American political mindset when it comes to foreign policy has to change, or else we're doomed in terms of having our relations in the Middle East.
Can we squeeze one more question in here up in front? Is that possible? Somebody can get a...
How do you compare, you know, Revolutionary Guard today with army in Shah's, you know, time?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, again, I'm not a scholar of the Shah's period of the Shah's army, but clearly the Shah's during the Shah's time, the army was very loyal to the Shah until the very last moment when they decided that they would become neutral in the battle when Bakhtiyar was prime minister and the Shah had left. But the army under the Shah was mostly it was manned by recruits, or not recruits, sorry, draftees doing their national service, who were mostly from rural areas, who were mostly from lower classes, or working classes, mostly very religious, and therefore not the most reliable army. And I think that was a lesson that Khomeini took when he started the Revolutionary Guards, or when the Islamic government said that the regular army is never going to be 100% reliable, because the vast majority of the army are made up of people who don't really want to be in the army. They're 18 years old, they can't get into college, or they can't get a deferment, so they get stuck doing 2 years national service. They're not necessarily loyal to the principles of a military organization. So let's create an organization that's going to be 100% loyal, that's going to be only ideologically committed to protecting the system. And that's how the Revolutionary Guards was created and became, I mean, obviously it was created during the Iran-Iraq Wars, when they became much more powerful and bigger and grew. But they've always been this group of people, and the people, even those who choose to do their national service in the Guards, it's, as Reza pointed out, it might be a cushier job, it might be easier, but there are advantages for it, and it becomes something that you become very loyal to in a way that you don't necessarily do doing your national service in the army. So it's, I mean, it's a difficult question. I mean, that's something for someone who's a scholar to go and examine the difference between the army under the Shah and the army, or the guard, the Shah's personal guard, the Javidan, for example. How loyal were they to the Shah, and in keeping the Shah's regime together? But the Shah, once the Shah left Iran, I think the army felt they had less of a loyalty to the system because he wasn't there. There are people who will argue that the Shah shouldn't have left, and he should have. I mean, that's all, looking at history, that's something that it's very hard to say. But I think the Revolutionary Guards was, if you're looking at it purely from the standpoint of a regime or a system, it was very smart of them to do that. It kind of guarantees that they're going to always have this very, very, very loyal army, very well equipped. They have their own navy, their own air force, their own, all kinds of much better equipped than the actual regular army. So I think that's really the only way I can answer that question.
Did you want to? Okay.
And thank you so much to our guests for an amazingly fascinating talk.